Video, I'm going to draw this thing, a fantasy portrait. We're going to take about 50 minutes. This is real-time, fully narrated. I'm going to walk you through how I create this in Procreate on an iPad Pro. As usual for a drawing codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. This is real-time, but I'm going to be using a sepia line technique that I've covered previously on the channel that I think really helps, particularly this type of illustration where we're trying to create something kind of sketchy. It's a little bit loose. We're just having fun, but this is going to add a lot of energy and life to both the process of creating that and also the finished look. I really think that if you just practice creating small little sketches like this, like illustrations where you're just drawing a portrait, something really simple, it's one of the best ways to just build those muscles of illustration, of composition, thinking about your 1, 2, 3 read. What are people looking at first? Where is your focus? All those basic foundational concepts. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you will join me. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about line and color illustration, the same style that I create all my comics and illustrations in, you can check out my free quick start guide. It's aimed to get you up and running quickly in Photoshop, developing your own simple, reliable line and color process. It's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out. All right, so let's do a quick little colored sketch of something really simple. In this case, we're going to be using Procreate on an iPad Pro. This is an M4 one with the Apple Pencil Pro. And I'm going to be using this sepia line technique that I covered in a previous video on the Drawing Codex channel. So go check that out if you haven't already. I'll leave a link to it at the end of this video and in the description down below. And that'll kind of show you how I am getting this kind of particular technique, which is nothing fancy, but I just think it is a fun way to kind of do some sketching. And we're going to use a couple of different techniques and sort of frameworks that I normally use when it comes to line and color comic book style illustration. We're going to start by thinking about just doing a thumbnail. So I'm going to sort of zoom this up so that it's a little bit easier to see in Procreate on the iPad. But, you know, I'm just going to do something really simple that is similar to a portrait or something. And what I like to do in this case is just kind of start pretty small and think about what that's going to look like, right? So again, this is a demo. I'm not going to be creating anything drastically sort of new. But when it comes to planning your images, what I like to say is try and spend at least 5% of your time planning the image. So in this case, maybe, I mean, I don't really know how long this will kind of take, but this is, you know, this would be max sort of a 1 hour sketch. It'll probably be way less than that. And, you know, it's worth doing a little 5-minute sketch. It's worth spending a couple of minutes doing a little sketch, doing a little thumbnail, and we'll sort of look at how we can utilize that. And, you know, why I think the idea of sort of drawing in an iterative fashion is really important. I'll sort of talk about that as I progress. But that's the first sort of thing that I'm always recommending people do. And it's just always a part of my process, right? The idea of kind of doing a little sketch, doing a little thumbnail sketch, giving yourself that initial time where you can be messy, right? You can make a giant bunch of mistakes and it's okay. And I think this also generally, I mean, the typical reasons that people enjoy doing thumbnail sketches is that it kind of means that because you're creating things smaller, you have a little bit more of a focus on those sort of large shapes. So if you kind of think about just the fact of how big is your line that you put down on the screen, and I've actually got a pretty big sort of chunky line here. This is quite a high resolution file, but I'm not sitting there going in and drawing with kind of fine detail. But even so, if I kind of just zoom up and be a little bit more loose and I'm drawing with this big brush, like I can, you know, I can add a lot of detail, but there is a degree to where there's just not much point in me going past a certain level of finesse here because you kind of can't. And what that means is that, you know, I can try and sort of finesse this and be like, oh, like, how does this nose go? But at some point, you know, I just need more actual size to do that properly. And, you know, that's a good way to kind of remind yourself, hey, it's time to, you know, stop finessing, stop like noodling, because, you know, we're doing thumbnails, right? So it's like a good way to remind yourself that we're not doing detail right now when you kind of think about this. So I think I'm just going to draw one of the comic book characters that I have kind of designed in the past, Ara from a fantasy book that I drew. And again, just because this is a fun demo, and I'm just going to try and focus as much as possible on talking about this process. Now, the reason that I like the sepia lines when it comes to just sort of sketching around is you can see it does mean that I get a pretty big high level of contrast between the white of the paper and between the line, just based on the color. So even though this is kind of faint, I feel like I still get a fair amount of contrast there. And it kind of also trains me to not sit there with a death grip and kind of just go over and over and over and over and over, right? Because you really sort of see. So one of the things is, as soon as I kind of start to hit a saturation point where it sort of goes dark, you really kind of start to notice. And I just find that this kind of helps to just train ourselves a little bit to have less activation force. Just, you know, draw lighter, basically. So again, super rough. And yeah, the more that you can, at this initial kind of thumbnail stage or your sort of rough phase, the more that you can just flow and, right, be a little bit more sort of, again, as they normally say, gestural, I think the better. But the other thing we can think about as we create a thumbnail is like, well, how big is this thing, right? Like how big should this be? And one of the things that I always recommend is like, yes, we're just doing little head sketches, right? There's nothing to separate what I'm doing from just kind of practicing drawing heads or just kind of messing around. I'm just sort of getting reps in, right? And you can learn a lot from doing this, but also when you're sort of beginning your artistic journey, one of the things that you can do is just use really simple exercises like this to improve your composition. So I can start to think about like, where is the frame of this thing? And you could draw the frame first, or you could draw it sort of last. It sort of doesn't really kind of matter too much. But the fundamental goal that I have is to improve and work on my sort of illustration skills a little bit. So I'm often thinking about, where is this character on the frame, right? There's a million different compositional rules or ideas you could sort of employ in terms of your sort of rule of thirds, right? And just thinking about, you know, where do those key elements lie, right? Like what are the shapes, right? Like if we sort of think about, you know, sort of the darker shapes and the lighter shapes, and how we're sort of creating some nice, right, negative shapes, positive shapes. Just thinking about these things and starting to, you know, stop just kind of drawing like, I've got one face here and I've got another face here. Just try and think about how this is sort of going to be composed, what ratio it is, how do I place the character on the page, how do I think about where my primary read is, right? What are people going to look at first? What are people going to look at second? So, you know, just kind of thinking about that, looking at that, I find is really helpful. What I'm going to do, again, just probably for the purposes of this demo, is duplicate that, and then we can resize this whole thing. And I can sort of think about, okay, like, yeah, like where would this go, right? Like where would this character go? I could, again, there's a whole bunch of different compositional rules or ideas I could kind of employ there, but that's the basic thing to consider. Is just build your intuition, right? Build your ability to instinctively place things in good areas. So I'm just sort of checking roughly the composition, and some of the perspective stuff there. All right. So now what I'm going to do is kind of go over this. Let's see. Yeah. And I'm still going to be drawing faintly, right? So this is still a sketch, right? I haven't really added, you know, enough compositional elements to really do anything sort of fancy here, right? Let's have a look at what this looks like in the actual kind of software program. So here you can see what it would actually kind of look like when it's not sort of washed out and on camera. And mostly what I'm doing is, yes, I'm following the original kind of sketch that I had, but I'm also trying to think about like where are some of those anatomical markers, right? I've got my sort of center line here. I probably need a little bit more sort of skull is what I'm thinking. I need a little bit more head. So again, still constructing. And one of the things that I think is good to do when you are sort of learning as well is to think about deciding whether or not you are going to, with a particular drawing, like, are you actually going to try and refine it a huge amount? Are you going to leave it sketchy? Like, what is the level of polish and finish that I kind of need? That's one of these things that I think if you kind of figure out early on, it's going to unlock a lot of creativity for you. Because if we really do need to, so I'm just kind of making up some different horns for this character that don't sort of really exist, but I'm just playing around. But yeah, if we sort of go back, boom, there. Yeah, I'm still just playing around, right? And if I was to say, okay, no, like this really does need to have, you know, a high level of polish, what I'd probably do is I'd add a step in between this where I did just work on and sort of play around with that high level of detail, right? And I'd do more construction lines, right? We would really think about, you know, lining a lot of this stuff up. I could be more constructive. I could go in there. And if I really need to, you know, figure out what's going on with the nose, for instance, again, it's a matter of adding that extra level of fidelity, that extra level of construction, and being able to mess around a lot more. If it's okay here for me to be a little bit loose and have some construction lines here, have a little bit of sketchiness, right? If that is something that's acceptable with the level of polish that I'm going for, then what I'm going to be able to do is do a little bit of that construction on the fly, right? So I can, if I got my, boom, there we go. All right, got my center line here. But, you know, I can kind of erase it. I can play around. You know, I've sort of found that center line, right? I've sort of got like a rough idea of, you know, where this kind of eye is going to go, you know, like what that's sort of going to look like. But, you know, I can erase, I can play around a little bit. But, you know, if you really want that high level of polish, right? If I need these lines to be 100% polished, right? So that there's nothing there at all that is sort of sketchy, then that's where you do need to do that extra pass to make sure that, yes, I still have the ability to do the construction, but it's okay. And often what you find is these sort of initial sketchy kind of lines that I do, you know, these will kind of disappear as I progress through the image. Let's just make sure. right? Finding that center line. Again, we can even do stuff like, roughing in, trying to find that kind of mouth. And then let's kind of zoom out and think about, like, is this actually working on a drawing perspective? So let's play around. Again, it's a sketch. We have a timeline that we're kind of following. And this is where, again, I find that the sepia, these kind of more colored lines, just mean that some of that sketchiness and some of that looseness does kind of fade into the background a little bit, right? It does tend to just kind of disappear. So I often found that when I was wanting to add and work in a sort of semi-finished style, this is where I find this type of line work, this type of sketchiness really kind of comes into its own. Because nothing needs to be super polished. But I do want it to have a little bit more than just, hey, this is literally just a pencil sketch, right? I want it to have a particular type of feel. Boom. And these are exactly the types of rough little kind of quick illustrations that I find really help to just build your competency. Probably at this level, this is going to be a really sort of simple process that I'm using, and I'm often talking about on the channel, building a simple, reliable process, something that just kind of works, something that you can rely on. I'm not using any sort of fancy tools, fancy techniques. We're just doing the basics. Boom. But just playing around, I think, with this type of simpler illustration does allow you to refine that process. It allows you to understand better, what does a drawing look like at this stage? Right? Like what does it look like here? And what do I need to do in order for it to succeed? So when we're dealing with processes, often one of the biggest and most challenging things is like every process has like an ugly kind of phase, right? Like every process that we have, there's going to be a place where it kind of doesn't look good, right? And it's often, for me, it is sort of around here. Oh, that earring is kind of not really in the right spot, is it? Let's follow that around. Again, tracing that, being like, where does this earring go? Somewhere a bit more like that. Again, it probably would be in a completely different sort of spot over there, but we'll kind of survive. But yeah, often, when you're dealing with process, you kind of have to go through these phases where like, I've been here a million times, like I'm pretty confident that if I keep working on this, this will turn out all right. I've done 100 other illustrations, 100 other little things like this, and this is not this is what they look like, right? This is fine. As opposed to, I think often what people struggle with in the beginning is just not really knowing and having a good grasp of where they are and what stage you're at and what your expectations for polish or character will be. Like often a lot of people do have a bit of a process where, like it doesn't really come together until just the finish, right? And in many cases, for a lot of us, you're not going to be able to add that kind of final character, right? That final sense of feeling until the very end. At the moment we're sort of building the groundwork for that. And in the same way, when I'm sort of adding the texture for this sort of fur-lined hood that she kind of has, again, the question is like, is this going to work, right? Like at this point, often when you sort of put the outline on something, right, it often looks a little bit lame, right? It's like, this is not quite working. And just putting in those reps, like just doing as many of these sort of little things will help you to flesh out all those little sort of process hiccups. And the other thing is, especially when you are being sort of sketchy or you're dealing with comic book style, we're often having to create this art so quickly, and it just takes a while to get a feel for whether or not it's going to work and how you can, rescue things. When we're drawing comics or you're drawing in this sort of comic book style, often it's not until you add the color, right? It's not until I add those kind of final touches. It's not until I, take the, right? Again, what I'll sort of end up doing eventually is like taking these off and then being like, oh, what lines do I have left? Like, does that work? And I'll show you some cool tricks for using this technique, how you can play around with that a little bit, right? Because we can leave some of these sort of sketchy lines there in the color. Again, I'm not sure whether I should put in some extra hair like that. It's not really on model. But yeah, like, how much texture should you put in the hair? Right? Like how should you draw the hair? How much structure should you give it? Should it just be, should I just make sure that it feels like this is really sort of slicked to her head? Boom. There's so many of these little bits and pieces where until you kind of finish it, until you, 10 times, take it all the way to color, figure it out. Yeah, you just never really know, whether or not it's gonna sort of work out. And I think just going through the repetitions and repeating the process, making sure your process is reliable. Again, I'm not 100% sure about the perspective on that sort of horn. I'll come back to that right at the end and see if I can be bothered with it. Boom. All right, I'm going to put this cloak as if it is coming down over her shoulders. And yeah, like one of the things you kind of learn is what you can get away with. Like what is important? Like what is not going to work in terms of putting in polish, putting in details, and what will no one notice? So we'll see. Boom. Again, just a sketch. Boom. All right. So yeah, we're probably done with the sketching, and you can see like this is pretty rough. This is not like fancy line work by any means, but let's see what we can do as we kind of add some color to it. Now, one of the things I'm going to do here is take this sort of sketch, and I'm going to reduce the opacity of it. And I'm also going to, like erase out the bits that really kind of don't work. All right, but there's probably a few bits here that, I might leave. Right, I think that sort of might be okay. Boom, let's go back to here. And now that I've done that, I can kind of remember. I'm like, oh yeah, let's see if we can polish this off. So I really like using this sepia to adjust these kind of subtler details, right? We can really use it and double down where you want to make it feel kind of really dark. But you can also add, you know, a little bit of shading. Right, like it's a lot easier to kind of differentiate between, hey, here's just a little bit of shading that I've done. Oh. Right, so you can kind of get a bit better at doing sort of normal pencil style renderings from my experience, because it just gives you a little bit more flexibility. And we'll see kind of how this starts to kind of interact with the color as I sort of put it underneath. But yeah, you kind of get the idea. Whereas typically what I'd find, like, you know, especially when you're dealing with something like the lips, is, you know, if you use drawing as a way to kind of really define like where the lips are, often it feels very harsh. Often it feels, when I'm doing that, like, oh, you know, I'm going too far. You know, I'm sort of delineating stuff, and yeah, bon. Yeah, I'm not sure about that horn. I'm gonna have to fiddle with that. Bon. But yeah, it's often only now where like I can sort of zoom in and be like, let's see if I can make some of this character exist, right? Like playing with some of the subtler aspects of the features, and often just like little marks here will make a huge difference. This is kind of what I find, right? Just being quite subtle with it. Again, this eye is not really based on any sort of anatomy. It's very sort of symbolic. But yeah, what I sort of tend to find is if I'm drawing in black and white, right, if we kind of take this off, right, you can kind of see that now like these features feel very harsh to me. Whereas now it's kind of lightening up some of those features a little bit. And I'm more confident now that like when I put some color underneath this, that it's kind of like the drawing is going to be able to be part of the story, right? And I think that's often what we kind of need to do if you do want to have like, you know, extensive line work. I find like some coloration of the lines is sort of really useful, because it kind of means that we're going to be able to blend with the, the color underneath in a more sort of interesting way. So again, a little bit easier, and kind of refine things. What do I need to do? So again, like this stuff down here, super rough, right? But now that I've been able to refine some of those facial features, and I've gotten rid of the sketch a little bit more, maybe it's like easier now. I can kind of come down and, right, sort of see how this works a little bit more. Again, let's see if I want to add a little bit of shading here. Right, I can sort of push some of the lines, make this sort of darker. Right, we can certainly make this a little bit darker. And again, one of the things that we learn about illustration is to prioritize the 1, 2, 3 read. And we also do that when it comes to detail. So, you know, here I've got some really, like, what I'm noticing are really sort of ugly details here, right? Like this, like the way that I'm sort of handling and constructing some of this stuff here is, to me, is like not really working. But because I know that it's kind of in the tertiary read, right? Like all these edges are probably just going to get a little bit lost, right? Because I sort of got some kind of cloak here, right? But I haven't really figured it out. I'm just like, I don't know. And this is, you know, this is part of the drawing process, part of the design process, right? It's part of saying, you know what, next time I really need to I really need to figure that out. Oh, what's happened there? Boom. Let's go. Hit. Get back to black. Boom. So yeah, you probably only see the drawing kind of maybe come to life like after these kind of points, right? You've sort of roughed it all in, you've sort of got it there, and now you can go and we can go and finesse it. But as I was saying, with illustration, a lot of it is figuring out like what can you get away with, like what is important, and what if you're on a deadline or you're trying to say, hey, you know, I'm speed painting this, I'm just going to get it done. I think part of that is understanding what happens to the sort of finished illustration, and often what we're doing is we are prioritizing, right? I'm going to make sure that the things that I know are going to make it in, such as the silhouette, right? If I put a bit of, if I finesse the silhouette here, or if I make it feel as if the silhouette has a little bit more life to it, right? If I go and refine the silhouette areas, the edge areas, these are these high contrast lines that are going to make more of a difference, right? And ideally we go through, you know, I probably rearrange, like erase all this kind of stuff. But in terms of practicing illustration and not drawing, what we're doing there is kind of saying, well, you know, probably this like whole sort of area here is going to be a little bit lost, right? And what I'm going to do is just kind of not pay too much attention to it, and hopefully, right, like hopefully that will kind of work. But yeah, I think we're pretty much done except for this, right? This awful problem that I've sort of created for myself here. But this is where also having this type of sepia line can really help, because I can sort of sit there and try and do some construction on it and sort of think about like where, again in my mind, like where is this thing going? Like what is happening with this? And only when I'm sort of sure, that's when I can come in and kind of go, okay, right, I feel like maybe I have some silhouette that, look, it's still kind of nonsense, right? I probably need to properly construct this, but you know, I feel like this is kind of getting a little bit closer. So, you know, doing sort of construction, right, you know, it's a lot easier to sort of trace things out, you know, do a few little sort of marks here and there, and boom, you know, when I want, they can kind of disappear. So I'm also just going to go back here and let's erase that, and also let's erase that. This is one of these things that I would do, like if I scan a drawing, when I used to create comic books where all of the art was traditional, yeah, you kind of have a process, a stage in the process where you kind of scan it in, and then you do what I would call kind of cleanup, right? Where I'm like, okay, where are these construction lines? Let's go hunting for messiness or stuff that kind of doesn't make sense, and we'll just kind of clean it up and erase it. But yeah, that's kind of, that's kind of what we're doing. Okay, so now below these white lines, and again, if you want to learn a little bit more about the particular technique that I was kind of using, I'm just going to do a really simple flat color pass on this. Oh, let's go out of there. Am I on the right layer? No, we need to be here. Let's make a couple of other layers there. And yeah, I'm just going to pick something like this. And I'm going to go through and just do that kind of flat line pass. But as I keep saying, we're going to be pretty rough with it. Let's go over to here and we'll kind of have a clearer picture of kind of what's going on. Yeah, so I'm just going through and trying to hit that outline. And because I can drag and fill in Procreate, I am really just focusing on that outline. I'm like, what is happening on that outline? And, you know, you can zoom up, but, you know, the more you zoom up, probably the more you're going to get lost in the weeds and start to finesse. And the reality is, we probably don't need to finesse here. This is just a sketch. So I always like to try and leave these with a little bit of energy or looseness or messiness. Again, that is a lot harder to do in the beginning. In the beginning, like, messiness works less well, but I think there is something to imagining that you're doing this traditionally and kind of you've only got one shot at it. And if it kind of messes up, like, that'll be okay. You know, if this was a watercolor or something and I kind of messed up one of these lines, you know, like, then I'd probably be a little bit more careful with it, right? Than I was just then. I'd probably really sort of focus on, like, okay, got to get this one right. Got to get that one right. You know, whereas if I'm doing that kind of undo, redo, then A, I'm not as careful, and B, it kind of often just looks a little bit sort of too tight, you know, when we do that. So again, that's our kind of like first step. Now I'm going to pick something to go behind that. That's like a little bit darker. So I'm going to pick something that is a sort of dark with light here, and probably this one. Yeah, let's go something like that. So again, in the digital, when you're kind of seeing it on the screen there, it's like pretty extreme. You can really sort of see that contrast. Probably in the sort of, this is on a camera, obviously you're seeing sort of less of that sort of contrast. But now what I'm going to do is see if I can sort of pick a sort of skin color. All right, let's see if we can. Yeah. Oh, firstly, let's get this and let's alpha lock it. And I'm going to basically leave everything that's not the skin or the hair for the moment. I'm going to leave it that color. And this is another one of those efficiency things that we get with like a simple, reliable process, thinking about a color scheme where I've kind of started with a dark color scheme. I kind of started with a essentially harmonious color scheme. There's nothing too different between the background and the actual character that I created. Most of the contrast that I'm going to create is through this skin, right? And so I'm getting like a very simple color scheme. And let's do, Ara has like very sort of blonde hair. Not the most original character design for a French comic book, but again, I was sort of going for classic at the time. Right, boom, boom. One of the good things about having your own characters, and this is another thing, let me hold that thought. One of the good things about having your own characters. Let's also understand that here I can kind of, you know, I can pick some of these kind of warmer colors. So if I have something that's like a, right, that's like a cool color, and I've got this sort of warm over it, it's very easy to pick a nice color that sort of goes in between. So I can more easily pick from the canvas and hopefully get something that looks kind of interesting. Yeah, one of the good things about having like a series of original characters that you've designed, even if maybe you don't feel as if you are, you know, like that they're all sort of amazing or anything like that. Again, like you don't have to be a professional comic book artist. a professional character designer, but if you have characters that you know, it makes practicing illustration a lot easier. Because, I mean, one of the tricks is often you're seeing so many great artists, and a lot of them are, you know, they are kind of doing their own characters, right? But you kind of don't realize that part of what makes you good as an artist is that you kind of know what you're drawing. So this is something I make a huge point of as well, in like most of the times I'm trying to sort of teach, is that often what will make you really good is that you kind of know what you're drawing, and it's one of the primary elements of like good drawing is that you kind of actually have the visual library, you've sort of put in the repetition. And if you're drawing a character that like literally you designed and it kind of fully suits your design aesthetic, like it solves so many problems. And I find like often students in the beginning are often getting really frustrated because they're kind of drawing stuff all the time that is completely different. And that's really taxing. And if you have your kind of original characters or your sort of little things that you know how to draw, it doesn't necessarily have to be a original character. People often like drawing fan art because then you kind of know what you're drawing, and that just makes a huge difference. Makes the whole thing about a billion times easier. Oh. All right, I've got the opacity down. So if you have your own original characters, I find it makes so much of the drawing practice significantly easier because you kind of learn how to draw them. You can then practice putting them in different compositions, different scenarios, right? Again, just makes everything a lot easier. Boom. So here again, I'm completing the picture of those lips. And I could also see if I can make the top lip a bit darker. That sort of might help as well. And again, I can sort of cut in, refine the shape. One of the other things to understand with what's really useful about line and color process is that you can do a huge amount of this refinement of the shapes and the feeling, like the eyes in particular. A lot of this can happen like at this phase. Oh. So, the specific way that I kind of draw the eye is really going to change the feeling of the character. But you're never going to see that, and you're never going to know that. You're never going to be able to practice that until you actually, go through the steps and, finish stuff off. All right. The other thing to think of as well, like, some good techniques if you feel like, oh, that's a little bit harsh, so let's just select that skin layer, right? I'm just going to lower the opacity, right? If then I sort of go over everything, it's going to take that way back, make it feel kind of more natural. And, often just homogenizing your colors in this way, even with the eyes, can be a really sort of useful thing to do. Same thing here, right? I can pick this color, right, and just sort of paint a bit of the warmer tones into it. Another good technique to kind of use that often I feel like gets a little bit lost because we're not sort of using Photoshop anymore is, right, sort of blending on the page and just sort of mixing one color in with another. Boom, boom. Move that opacity up. So yeah, it can be good to kind of creep up on some of these values, right? Just kind of like add a little bit if you have the opacity down, right? If you're trying to sort of put one thing in there, another thing in there, right? If I did want to kind of put some shadows, right? It can be good to kind of, if you're sort of like, oh, how much do I put in there? Let's just practice, right? With like sort of low opacity. Be like, is that too much? Like, oh. again, you know, eventually you'll probably get something that feels a little bit better. Right now I can select that. Let's put the opacity back up. Right. And, you know, again, I don't have to go through and do some super realistic rendering pass, right? But I can just choose to just add a little bit here and there. And again, we could sort of tone that down if that seems a bit much. Play with the opacity, do a little bit of sort of painting-y stuff, whatever, right? Whatever we want. And yeah, we can refine, or I'm probably just gonna leave it because I feel like this is sort of doing the job that I need it to do. Just sort of quick color, right? If you wanted to, again, sort of do more, right? It's just a matter of, again, I could think about like, let's see if that does work, if that's kind of in shadow. I can add some shading to it. Again, super basic, but that will do. Again, if you really wanted to go crazy, we could, right, do that, or we can also just keep playing around with less opacity, right? So this feels like it's a little bit kind of softer. So again, these are the little kind of process things that, I kind of learned to do over the years using this, type of style, just kind of playing around with sort of one brush, and you can kind of leave it flat, or you can keep playing around, whatever kind of floats your boat. But, this is normally what I'm sort of talking about and thinking about when it comes to just doing a, basic sort of sketch pass. And, the other thing that we can do is add some more sketchiness, right? It doesn't need to be fully realistic in terms of, adding rendering to everything. I feel like maybe these could be better off like that. I think that's actually kind of the tonality they're meant to be based on the design. And I would also sort of play around with like how much of this background, right, do we want to leave abstract, right? Do I just want it to be a flat color, or, should we add some sense of something there? Again, let's go to, right, the actual, yeah, let's go here. Oh. So we can actually kind of see it. So I'm just basically just drawing with some different kind of colors in this kind of background, trying to create some just interesting shapes, something there, and I'll go over in a minute and probably kind of knock that back a bit. Boom. So again, this is just sort of like doing texture, but I guess just with a silly little brush, right? And these are often, again, like little sort of techniques you can use to add a little bit of drama, right? Like a little bit of texture. Again, I'm sort of going over, right, with sort of different colors and things, and this will just give us a little bit more. To work with. And this is also where you can start to think about the idea of the composition, right? Like where, like where do I want to lead the eye? How can I use this background to help me create sort of negative space or sort of movement within the image, right? Like I'm trying to create a bit more of a, right, sort of a pathway down here with this kind of lightness. Boom, 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 right? Again, super basic. But these are often, little things you can do. And it just makes it feel a little bit less flat if that's kind of what you want. Again, we could think about adding a bit more, right, sort of tonality here. Now, often this is what you find also is like, once you kind of start building things up, right? I'm starting to build up a few bits and pieces here and there. You can start to kind of see where maybe a bit more value would be good over here or over there. So it is good to sort of progressively add more contrast, work things up, and I'll probably see that there's a couple of cool places to put some darker colors. I'm like, well, that's not going to work. But it's always good to give yourself an opportunity to sort of plus the drawing, right? Like add some extra sort of drawing elements at the end, because that means, when I am sort of working on that sketch initially, I'm not like, oh, this is it, I can't do anything after that, right? If I'm allowing myself to, add a bit of extra stuff, even at the end, then it always gives me a bit of freedom, right? And a good sort of way I often like to do that is, using some sort of reds or something like that. Let's, again, look at doing something where I can add a few little bits of punchy, right? Bit of extra contrast here and there, right? Again, we could add it around the nose. I can push here. And again, if I know that I can sort of add those little bits and pieces, I find it kind of makes all the difference. But yeah, that's probably all we got time for. Just a simple sketch. I don't know how long this one took. Again, sort of just under an hour, just playing around. Yeah, but there we go. Let's take a look back on the screen, on the camera. And yeah, this is sort of what we're left with. And these are the types of images that I find are just sort of really useful and fun to do. It's sort of half an hour to an hour is normally sort of what I'm thinking. We're just doing portraits, but I'm trying to think about like, where are the shapes? Where's the composition? Again, where's my primary read? Where's my secondary read? How much detail do I add? How do I deal with this? How do I deal with that? All these little things that you do when you're making an illustration like this will just go towards building your illustration muscle, right? Like building the intuition and the instinct for like, oh, I was there, I did this that time, and I kind of solved it this way. And it's those kind of skills that I think are really, really important to build. Anyway, that's all I got time for in this particular video. Hopefully this was a useful demo, and I've showed you how I would use this sepia lines technique when I'm just kind of doing these half an hour to an hour sketches. If you want to learn more about that technique, creating sepia lines and kind of the particular layer setup, check out this video because it covers the whole thing.